Hi, and welcome to the first of several videos about the P5JS project, the Quilt project, where we assemble graphics you produce or multiple people produce into an aggregate structure, which I'm calling a quilt. Um, this video will talk about the about the IDE we're using, the P5JS web app, which lets you create and debug and view your results. And we'll also enumerate the files that are part of um, the quilt and basically talk a little bit about each file. In a subsequent video, I'll talk in more detail about the some of the files, especially those pertaining to conversion from Python to JavaScript. We can start with the IDE itself. That's what you're looking at on the screen. That has several major panels. When it starts up, I think it looks like this. And if you immediately, I think you'll want to do this, immediately click the arrow here to expand, you'll see a pane that shows you the sketch files. These are the files that comprise the project. These are all the files that are used and included into the JavaScript project that we're producing to make the quilt. Um, they're listed on the left side, and if you click on each, as you click on each one, it will become viewable in an editor window, which is the pane immediately to the right. Below the editor window is a console, and console is basically a output window for messages produced with the JavaScript log.console method, which is a simple method of printing text or numbers to the screen. And it can also be used to examine variables and particularly objects, aggregate variables in your code and see the current structure and values, which is a very handy feature. So the console is a great utility for that. On the very far right is a currently black window that shows the output graphic when you run the program successfully. So um, let's start. In this case, it looks like I can go ahead and run it with the square button stops execution, just pauses it, stops it, and the triangle button runs it. So I'm going to run the code now. And there's a sort of crude example I put together. It needs some explanation, and more explanation will be available in the next video. But you can see that it shows up in the right-hand pane. Okay, starting from through the files, let's start with index.html, since that's really the container or configuration file that holds this app together. It's a web app, so it needs an index.html, so the browser will have something, a place to start. You can put anything you want in the index.html, any HTML you want, but I have put minimal HTML in the sense that all I'm doing is calling out those things which are necessary to make this example work. One of those is including the P5JS code. That's a minified version of a JavaScript program that does all the graphics that we're seeing on top of what JavaScript provides naturally. There's a reference to a style sheet. So if you're very knowledgeable about HTML and web development, you could in turn change your um, edit your style.css to produce more effects. I'm not very familiar with that, so I'm going to leave this as the stock um, style.css script, CSS script, but it's got to appear. Then below that are the actual JavaScript source files, P5JS JavaScript source files that are included and used in our project. And you can see them listed there under source equals. And these will become available to the program and these will appear in the left-hand pane over here as sketch files. So you can click on them there and open them up and edit them as necessary. Okay, um, let's look at the logically next file, which is block.js. This is the parent class for a quilt block. So when you look in the right-hand pane, all of the little graphics you see are contained in a 100 by 100 pixel block. And the block, there's obviously multiple blocks on the screen, and each of those blocks, even though they look very different and they are coded differently, derive a lot of their behavior from the block parent class. That is, things like 9-patch inherit from block. See, class 9-patch extends block. So 9-patch gets all of the methods of block and all the attributes of block, plus it can add its own attributes, and you can add your code to draw a specific design. What's in block is pretty simple. There's a move to method, which is key. That's what actually controls the positioning of the block on the canvas. So the numbers there as we move through the program cause the blocks to appear in different locations, specifically in a grid work of locations. The render method, um, in this case, just would render very simple shapes. But we're going to override that with a render method in the derived classes, in the inherited classes, child classes, that will actually do something more interesting. Here's an example. If you look at 9patch.js, that inherits from block, gets all of the attributes of block, including a bunch of colors and information, and has a render method, renders what actually draws things, has a render method that actually draws something. Specifically, it picks colors, it picks line sizes, and then it draws, in this case, 4 triangles, or actually 2 triangles forming 4 triangles, which are the ones you see here as you go down these 2 columns. And this triangle command is part of P5JS, as is fill and many other graphics commands. They're built in to P5JS, and they came in when we sourced P5JS into our project. The next one I'll go to, I'm going to skip over. P5.js is the actual minified JavaScript code that implements all of the detailed graphics, and we're not going to look at that right now. It's not going to look like anything if you click on it. And if you want to look at what's actually in there, of course, it's all open source, so you can go to the web and find it, but you won't need to tinker with it. Pin.js, I'll come back to, because we're going to need that if we do any attempts to basically port some of your Python Turtle graphics code into a Quilt block in this JavaScript framework. It contains methods to do, it contains a JavaScript implementation of Turtle graphics, basically. Quillt.js we do need, and that's actually a container class. So you may have studied in, or you will study in classes like Java, where you talk about object orientation. You will study the idea that there are 2 kinds of relationships among classes. One is inheritance. That extends the is-a relationship. And a 9patch is a block. It inherits from block and extends block. The quilt does not inherit from block. In fact, it's a container class. A quilt has a block. It actually has an array of blocks. So that's the has a relationship. That's containment. So you can inherit from another class, and you can contain objects of that other class within your class. Those are the 2 fundamental principles, actually, of object-oriented programming. If you look through Quilt a little bit, there's an add block method that puts a quilt into actually an array. There's actually there's 2 arrays. There's an array of arrays, which is how you represent a 2-dimensional array in JavaScript. And by putting a block in the array as the appropriate location, that determines where it will appear when the quilt is drawn, because Quillt will then iterate through the arrays, drawing all the blocks it comes to. That's the basic idea. And that's the render method here. The render method of Quillt, you can see it looping through rows and columns. And at each point, it's then calls the move to method. Remember, that was back in block, which positions the graphic on the canvas at the appropriate place, and then it draws itself. That's the proper terminology. It calls the object's render method to draw it on the screen. If object-oriented terminology is unfamiliar to you, it's best to get some grip on it through activities like these, because it comes up in many languages. It comes up in C++, it comes up in Java, and you can actually do OO programming in Python just as well. Python has object-oriented capability with the idea of inheritance and containment, same basic principles. I'm going to skip Sierpinski.js. That's a specialized fractal that we're drawing. That's actually the little triangles, the embedded triangles you see here. Those were drawn by the code that's in Sierpinski. And we'll talk about that in more detail in another video. The point is, once having drawn them, we can then use them as a block and reproduce them over and over again. Sketch.js is kind of where everything starts. You could think of it as a main for the P5JS style or P5JS idiom of programming. And that is that there must be a file named sketch.js, and it must provide two methods to satisfy the framework, because P5JS is really a framework. It's a much more simple framework than, say, React or Vue, but it's a framework in the same sense that it provides structure and provides methods to facilitate creating active web pages with JavaScript. It's got to have setup, which is a method that's called once and only once to do something. And that's actually the only method in sketch.js we're going to use. You can also have a method called loop. Here you see it being turned off, that would repeat code over and over again. That's a very useful thing in general. We're not using it in this graphics example, but you can put code in loop to make your sketch interactive. And that's where you can read mouse events, or you can look for clicks and drags and so forth and so on, prompt for input, and go on with the kind of interactive behavior that you may have put in some of your Python programs. But we don't need it here, and we're not using it. So we turn it off and just use, pardon me, setup. And setup is creates the arrays that we need and goes through and populates these arrays with the appropriate objects. In other words, you see there's four columns here, and there's two columns of triangles, the Sierpinski curves, and there's two columns of 9-patch quilt blocks, which are also triangles, confusingly enough. I'm talking there about the blue and turquoise ones versus the purple. As it loops through, you can see it instantiates is the OO word, a 9-patch block and a turtle sample block. And those create objects. You get back what you get back from new 9-patch. That calls 9-patch's constructor, and that returns a reference to a new 9-patch instance. And that gets stuffed into the appropriate row and column of the array. And I'm just doing I'm doing odd and even. That's what the mod 2 is doing. So you get one column of Sierpinski triangles, and you get one column of 9-patch, then you get Sierpinski triangles, then you get 9-patch. So turtle sample we'll talk about in more detail in another video. That's actually a block that you can use to convert some of your Python code into JavaScript code and then display it as a block in this quilt. Um, Last one I'm going to talk about in this video is called, it's a long name so it gets cut off, Turtle Sample, turtlesample.js. It's obviously a sample block, and that one is the one that draws the Sierpinski triangles, and we'll talk about that further. So to recap, we went briefly over the IDE here, the web app IDE, because that's what you're really creating in P5JS is a web app. We talked about the code window where you can edit. We talked about the console window where you can debug and see test messages that you want. And we talked about the display, the canvas over here, where the results actually appear. One more thing I will say about the console is that one very useful feature is that in addition to putting your own messages up there, kind of got here sort of debugging, low level debugging messages, you can also display, if you just console.log quilt, you will get the object and all of its attributes and any objects it contains. And since Quilt contains a lot of objects, you get a fairly sophisticated display. So here, so it's all with one command, just log.console paren quilt, close paren. And you can see it has an attribute for a number of rows, a number of columns, and a block size. All the blocks are 100 pixels by 100 pixels. Colors, and then an array of blocks, which is in turn an array for the reason I said before. To get a 2D array, a two-dimensional array, you must have an array of arrays. So think of this as the rows and each of these as the columns. Each has 4 elements for a total of 16. And in that array are the blocks. There are turtle sample blocks and the non-patch block we looked at. And if you expand a non-patch block, you'll see it has a height and a width attribute. It has a color, and it has attributes showing its location on the screen, and it's not rotated. So that turns out to be pretty handy when you're examining these objects and looking inside them. You don't have to do a lot of complicated printing. All you really have to do is to use console.log. I think you can see that right over here. So all the output I was expanding with little triangles down in the console panel came from just simply logging, using a built-in JavaScript method, console.log, to expand that particular object. That's all for now, and I'll come back with more detail in the specific things about turtle sample and pin and Sierpinski in the next video. Thanks a lot.